Hey, it's Chris, Liege Games. Let's talk Bloodstone tonight. What do you need to know about Bloodstone? What makes it what it is? How does it compare to other similar games on the market? And which one is right for you? Let's talk about Bloodstone, a few of the very similar games, and what you need to know to make the correct decision for your gaming shelf. Let's compare tonight Bloodstone to several of its more modern day competitors that have also recently been released or are in the process of being released with expansions of Bloodstone versus Arena the Contest versus Super Fantasy Brawl. Now, if you're not familiar with Bloodstone, Bloodstone is a player versus player as well as a player versus environment / game by Druid City Games that is styled after the arena system a la the Roman Colosseum. Forenamed Bloodstone being the object of power and adoration and all are seeking to obtain. Let's talk about this game for a minute. What makes this game unique? First off, it plays 1 to 8 players, which is a lot higher player count than many of these other games. The other side of things that you can play this with 1. Now, as a player versus player game, that doesn't make any sense, but we'll skip over that. The main difference, first off, is that this is more of a Kickstarter exclusive campaign, meaning it is not going to go to retail, unlike some of the other games that I will be mentioning. These are all heavily based miniature games. So right there, you know what you're getting in all 3 of these. Consequently, the price point will be reflected of that in all 3 of these games that I will be talking about. So we're going to take that as an aside for a minute, and we'll come back to, towards the end, the actual head-to-head comparison of price. Right from the get-go, you get 8 heroes of varying classes and abilities and descriptions, as well as 8 monsters with 28 monster miniatures. 2 of these 3 games, Bloodstone and Super Fantasy Brawl, both utilize a hexagonal map as opposed to Arena the Contest, which goes with the more classic square grid. And that plays into the tactical nature of the difference between these 3 games. The other big difference, right from the start, is the abilities and how you use them or mitigate them between all 3 games. Let's take a step back here a second. Let's talk about the objective of this game versus the other games. The objective of this game is, in its heart, PvE or PvE, as I mentioned earlier. The player versus player is just a brawl. So it is very akin to Super Fantasy Brawl. It can have teams in Super Fantasy Brawl when it is more just 1v1v1 in Bloodstone. Super Fantasy Brawl, like I mentioned, is really only a 2 to 4 player game. It is much more streamlined. It takes advantage of the fact that you have a little bit more simplicity in the initial setup, and so it is faster to get to the table, and it is more of a self-contained individual session of head-to-head combat. Both Teneris Adventures, the new expansion for Arena the Contest, as well as the base game, really is more of the campaign-style game in the player versus environment thing. Whereas still the player versus environment in Bloodstone is really still just a head-to-head boss battler, more akin to sort of Kingdom Death, or the recently funded in 2020 Townsfolk Tussle, where you are proceeding with fighting boss, upgrading, getting stronger, fighting boss. Teneris Adventure does have the upgrade system, it does have the improvement and the abilities and upgrade, but there is more of a system, there is more of a campaign and an objective on a map that you are trying to achieve rather than just kill or be killed, where Bloodstone, as well as Super Fantasy, put their emphasis. The other biggest difference right from the get-go is how you use your characters. Bloodstone heavily emphasizes dice rolling. In fact, you can say it is the most emphasized mechanism within the game. Period. You have your custom set of asymmetrical dice. Every single of those 8 characters has an asymmetrical set of abilities that correlate and that require the use of those dice. The bosses also have the ability to not only have their own dice, but to interact with the player's dice in terms of being able to put dice within the player's pools that they must use, more so even applicably in the player versus player. Arena the Contest is more of the D&D style. I roll a d20 and I either succeed or I fail on my attack based on the modifications and my abilities at the base. But Arena the Contest is sort of an amalgam or a mishmash or a Venn diagram of the Bloodstone in the Super Fantasy Brawl as well. Because if we go to the opposite end of the spectrum, Super Fantasy Brawl flat out says we are not using dice. There are no dice here, no dice system, emphasizes that, shouts it like Robin Williams in Aladdin as the genie with the blinking sign, and says this is what we're emphasizing things on. They are taking these decks that are constructed and using them and combining them on your team. And they're using a color system in order to choose what actions you are going to be doing a turn, as you can only play one color. But you also have the ability to react, which will burn that color for use during your own turn if you use it on someone else's turn. Arena does both. Arena has attack cards, it has action cards, it has scroll cards, it has artifact cards, it has spell cards that you're all going to be using, but its core remains with a lot of these actions and these abilities as a dice roll, being a very heavy influence, and perhaps a make it or break it in many cases. So right there should be the big blinking flashing sign, like I just mentioned in Aladdin, of do you want dice? Do you want dice and cards? Or do you just want cards? How do you choose to mitigate? How much luck do you want? Do you want the luck to be the draw? Do you want to be the luck of what you can collect and upgrade with a little bit of die rolling? Or do you just want to roll the dice, chuck it, and see what happens? The other biggest difference is what are you looking for in this game, like I mentioned, like I have alluded to in several other points briefly. Bloodstone is very much bash or be bashed. There is a campaign, there is an element of the progression system up from one boss to the next boss to the next boss, and having to adapt strategy and having to adapt a little bit of tactics and some abilities as you slightly upgrade along the way. But there is no overarching, massive plot line, storyline, branching arcs, and completion in that sense. There is no capture the flag. There is no do this objective necessarily on the map and rescue the hostages or anything to that level, where Arena utilizes all of those things. If nothing else can be said, Arena is said by many of the people who play it and the reviews that are out there to have one of the more unique, the more interesting quest system objectives on a map that is not just go from point A to point B or go there and kill this guy, as you see a lot of the complaints being even in the top rated game of Gloomhaven, where it becomes sometimes very samey from one dungeon to the next. Arena has done a great job in capturing the magic of making it feel like it's a different thing each time, for the most part. Super Fantasy Brawl, again, there is no campaign there. Team, fight, fantasy, brawl. The name says it all in that sense. Not a whole lot else needed there. You're getting what you signed up for. It is more of the typical multiplayer online battler, the MOBAs, taken in more of a tabletop form. This is not Half-Life. This is not Elder Scrolls. This is a MOBA. Let's talk about those enemies for a minute. As I mentioned, Super Fantasy Brawl, it is what it is. It's just player versus player. It's very asymmetrical, but each person has relatively the same thing, and you're using these decks on whichever side you are, whichever character you are, doesn't matter. Tenaris Adventure, again, similar sides. Bosses have their own things. Dragons have their own things. Villains have their own sets of decks, actions, abilities, and spells. And Bloodstone is very much the same within its own right of its players versus its villains in that sense, is that they have their own abilities. They have their own dies. They have their own things on the board. They have, you could maybe argue, some of the more adaptive AI system than many of the other games out there, as it is more of a true boss battler when you fight these, and how you're going to have to adapt with how they are interacting with you. You cannot just do your thing and ignore what they are doing to do whatever you want. So now let's go back to the beginning. Let's talk that ever divisive, sometimes most important aspect of things, as much as we hate to admit it, of price point. Bloodstone. The core game, $125 for all that you are getting with your 8 champions, your 8 bosses, and all of the little tidbits that come with it. A single boss expansion that goes along with it is available for another $20. They also offer a bunch of other non-gameplay, including a playmat, a set of dice, and a novel, which brings the whole up to $199 before shipping. For the sake of this argument, we're just going to exclude shipping. Arena is a completely different beast. The core in Arena is $69 from the first campaign redone. If you want the expansion, the Tenaris expansion, which adds a whole nother cooperative campaign, it's going to cost you $100. but it comes with the free Madness Box expansion, as seen here. The Dragon Collection is another $69, where you're getting these massive 5 dragons as alternative bosses, or alternative elemental dragons that you can fight against, or even maybe use on your team within the campaign, depending on how you play it. You can get them painted, you can get it bundled with everything in there for $235. But that is the Teneris, the base game, and the dragons right there. And this, to be very frank, is probably a lot more content than the actual $199 of Bloodstone. You are getting much more content in this price for approximately $40 more than the $145, which gets you all of the gameplay for Bloodstone. But you're talking almost $100 difference too, and is it worth it? Are you better off with just going the core? If you're just going off with the core, Arena becomes the much better value. Now let's talk Super Fantasy Brawl here for a minute. Where does that tie in? Core box is $49 because you are just getting a PvP type game. The all-in was only $89. So the all-in for the PvP experience, if that is where you truly desire things, is going to be much less than the core of Bloodstone, for arguably more characters, or a total of 15 champions as opposed to the 8 in Bloodstone, because you're not having to pay for the PvE side of things, but you are losing the monster, the villain aspect of things as well. You're paying less, you're getting less, but you're paying for just the element. So for me, as someone who may, let's take for example, not be interested in the PvP element of things, I'm paying $145 for Bloodstone essentially for just the PvE. And so then the question is raised, is that worth it? When you have something like this, although completely different mechanisms, for essentially almost half the price. That's the type of breakdown that you need to be aware of. How much are you paying for what you want? How much are you also paying for what you don't want in each of these systems or each of these games? It's important to be aware of, especially when it comes to the cost. Now, I definitely did not try to exclude other games that are similar to Bloodstone here. The problem is, it isn't exactly like a lot of the other games out there, and I say that as a positive. It doesn't fit the dueling or necessarily some of the other PvP ones that are out there. It doesn't hold the traditional style of a dungeon crawler or a deck builder or even just a regular campaign game. So that's why I didn't really compare it to something like Dice Throne Adventures, which is part of the hotness now that's come out, because Dice Throne Adventures is more of a dungeon crawl, crawling through cards and doing these one-on-one little skirmishes before you get to the final boss. Although it shares the mechanism of the Yahtzee-esque style rolling to activate your abilities. But that is about it. So I didn't feel like it was necessarily the best comparison there either, just because of the divergence otherwise. So what do I think? The more I've thought about it, I wish that somehow they could have split the PvP and the PvE elements, because I just do not think that the PvP for me is ever going to get played. And so that's the reason I am not backing currently. Now, will that change before the end of the campaign? There's a good chance that it may. At the same time, that is an awful lot of money to spend on potentially half of the gameplay that's being offered and presented as part of the core package of what this game truly is and what's meant to be. I would really be disappointed in myself by not being able to utilize that side of things. So right now, for me, it's a pass. But honestly, I'm not sure any of them are quite the perfect fit. I think the perfect fit would be the PvE of Bloodstone by itself. But not having that, I'm really going to have to weigh how much the other is worth not having. So that's where I'm at. Let me know where you're at. Which one of these would you prefer? What else should we be comparing it to? What else is out there? I know there's always stuff that I miss and other games that would be a good fit in terms of comparisons. So let me know in the comment section. Let me know if you like this. I like doing these, especially with some of the new Kickstarter games, so you can get a better sense of what you should be aware of and how it compares to what else is already out there, because sometimes stuff flies under the radar, for me included. So, okay. Thanks for watching. Stay classy.